Hello there, and a very good Friday morning to all our viewers out there. Welcome to the Breakfast Rundown with me, Zulfick Farzan. Now, Bangladesh has entered into a new chapter, marking a new chapter in history after the president administered oaths onto its new government led by Nobel Prize winner Dr. Mohammad Yunus. Now, Dr. Yunus reached Bangladesh last afternoon and directly went and met with the Bangladeshi president, and then thereafter late in the night the interim government headed by Dr. Yunus was sworn in the presence of many officials and including representatives of the protest movement. Now 14 members of this new government, including 2 student representatives of the 17-member strong body of the new interim government, were sworn in at the Banga Bhavan in the presence of the Chief of Army Staff. Now, the Chief of Army Staff is actually the person who delivered the announcement on Monday that former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina had resigned from the position and handed over into an interim government. Now, Dr. Mohammad Yunus is better known for championing the microcredit scheme via his Grameen Bank. It's a new business model that he introduced to help with the low-income earners in Bangladesh. Now, Dr. Yunus earlier served as an advisor to the 1996 caretaker government of Bangladesh, and thereafter for his efforts in improving the microcredit efforts in Bangladesh through his Grameen Bank, he won the Nobel Prize in 2006. Now, the transition into a new interim government comes after the country's longest-serving Prime Minister, Awami League President Sheikh Hasina, resigned in a citizens' uprising on Monday. Now, significantly, this is the first time in Bangladesh that 2 fresh graduates have received roles as advisors in the Bangladeshi government. Now, after 17 long years, the people of Bangladesh have witnessed the swearing in of an interim government in their country. Now, the chief advisor of the newly formed interim government, Dr. Mohammad Yunus, has categorically said that punishment for all sorts of crimes will be ensured soon, and the lost glory of all the Bangladeshi state institutions will be restored. Now, the chief advisor said that this message will be applicable to all ministries, agencies, government institutions, and other various bodies spread out across Bangladesh. Now, he also declared that the students have achieved victory on behalf of the people of Bangladesh. Now, at the same time, now you know that Sheikh Hasina, the former Prime Minister, fled in a military helicopter across the border into India. Now, there's still speculation of what she is going to do. Is she going to remain in India? Is she seeking asylum elsewhere? Now, there have been reports that she had requested for asylum in the UK, the US, and some other countries as well. However, none of those have been confirmed yet. Now, at the same time, Sheikh Hasina is currently in India in a safe location. Now, according to her son, she will not be returning to Bangladesh and will not be returning to engage in politics as well. Now, while she is in India, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has extended his best wishes to the new interim government of Bangladesh, led by Dr. Mohammad Yunus. In a tweet, Modi expressed hope for a swift return to normalcy. Now, he's emphasizing the importance of ensuring safety and protection of all communities in Bangladesh. Now, following reports of violence that erupted again after the resignation of Sheikh Hasina on Monday afternoon. Now, he has affirmed that India is committed to working closely with Bangladesh and improve ties between both countries. Now, while the situation in Bangladesh is being watched closely by everyone across the world, the situation in Sri Lanka is also being watched closely. Why? Because on the 21st of September, Sri Lankans will be heading to the polls to vote for the next president of the country. Now, before the September 21st elections comes the postal voting process. Now, the window for accepting applications for postal voting ends tonight. Now earlier the deadline was supposed to end on the 5th midnight. However, due to the significant lower application turnout, the Election Commission decided to extend the deadline, awarding an opportunity for more public servants and for more individuals to come forward and submit their applications for the postal voting process. Now, in a statement earlier, the Election Commission said that public servants who wish to engage in the postal voting process must visit the relevant election officer and submit their applications to ensure that they are eligible to engage in postal voting. Now, postal voters are also encouraged by the Election Commission to visit the Election Commission's website to ensure that they are registered voters and are eligible to exercise their franchise for the presidential election. Now, today the Election Commission is going to meet with Sri Lanka police. Now, this is to finalize the security arrangements for nomination day, which is on the 15th of August. That's next week. Now, this high-level discussion is expected to draw many senior ranking police officers from the police force, and all the security arrangements for nomination day as well as the presidential election in September are expected to be discussed. Now, the Election Commission is to hammer out a robust security plan to ensure a smooth and secure nomination process next week. Now, in a related development, the Election Commission also held discussions with election monitoring bodies as well. And then thereafter, election monitoring bodies also held discussions with Sri Lanka police as well. Now, Executive Director of PAFRL, Rohan Hettiarachchi, speaking to Newsfirst, said that the urgency of implementing immediate action to curb any potential election law violation was extensively discussed with the police officers during that meeting. Now, at the same time, election law violations are on the rise. More than 120 complaints have been received by the country's Election Commission with regard to the violation of election laws. Now, the National Election Commission said now it is going to deploy new specialized teams to government institutions that are accused of flouting the election laws. Now, this move comes as the Commission has been inundated with multiple complaints that government institutions are in fact violating election laws on the run-up to the September 21st presidential election. Now, the Commission has warned that if the directives to halt these election law violations are completely disregarded by the state institutions in question, these specialized teams will be mobilized to take action against such institutions. Now, the Election Commission also said that the secretaries of 2 government ministries were summoned following complaints of election law violations at those respective institutions, and the Election Commission is stressing that it is mandatory for all public officials employed at government agencies, government institutions, departments, ministries, etc. to comply with the guidelines that have been issued via the circulars with respect to the presidential election. Now, the Election Commission has warned that those who fail to comply with the guidelines that have been issued with regard to the presidential election will be strictly dealt with, and they will face consequences for failing to follow those directives. Now, speaking of Sri Lanka, in 2022, Sri Lanka entered into an economic crisis, and one of the major comments that were made at that time to overcome this crisis is the need to reform state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka. Now, thereafter, the Finance Ministry set up what is called the State-Owned Enterprises Restructuring Unit, led by Suresh Shah. Now, this restructuring unit has been working with the restructuring of many state-owned enterprises. They have been speaking of many stakeholders. They have been getting many input from various parts, various quarters, and now the process is underway with respect to certain state-owned enterprises. Now, Suresh Shah, speaking at a forum organized by Advocata Institute late last evening, pointed out that over the years, while Sri Lankan governments managed state-owned enterprises, successive governments did not focus its attention on the key resources of the country. Now, what are these key resources? Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
As the national assets, and we put resources into those, but we miss the true national assets that this country has, and we don't invest behind them. So let me give you a few examples of what the true national assets of this country are. Number one is our younger generation. Our younger generation, if we teach them the true values, if we give them the right education, they can transform this country. But do we invest behind our younger generation? Is our education system, does it get the necessary resources? It doesn't. But Sri Lankan Airlines gets the resources it needs. If it's running at a loss, government doesn't hesitate to pump money into Sri Lankan Airlines. But do we put the same amount of money that the education system needs? We don't. Think about our irrigation system. You know, our irrigation system takes rainwater and distributes it to the last acre of a farmer's land. This is a unique system. It's a tremendous asset that we have. How much money, how much resources have we put behind our irrigation system? If we invest in our irrigation system, just imagine the transformation it can do to the agriculture sector of this country. And through that, just imagine the transformation we can make for the country itself. But we don't invest behind our irrigation system. Take our maritime boundary. You know, our maritime resources are 3 times our land mass. What's the investment we have done into our maritime sector? Nothing. Imagine if we invest in that maritime sector, if we put our resources into the maritime sector. Imagine the transformation that we can do for this country. So the point I'm making is that we have ignored the true national assets because we have run after these commercial enterprises. We are missing the wood for the trees, unfortunately.
Well, that was the Director General of the State-Owned Enterprises Restructuring Unit, Suresh Shah, who was making some important points with regard to the restructuring of enterprises and also investing in key resources in the country. Now, Field Marshal Sarath Fonseca is one of the key presidential candidates who had announced his candidacy to run for the highest office in the country. Now, he was in India recently. Now, upon arriving in the country, he said that today he will be making a special announcement to the country. Now, ahead of arriving in Colombo, in India, he spoke to international media. Now, speaking to international media in India, Field Marshal Sarath Fonseca stressed on one of the key elements that has been in discussion in Sri Lanka. That is the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Let's have a listen to what Field Marshal Sarath Fonseca had to say about 13A.
No, talking about 13th Amendment, all the politicians just trying to harness the votes in the north and east, the minority votes. They come and give promises. But that's a very sensitive issue. So if I strongly believe, and it is nothing but right for us to treat everybody alike in the country. There can't be second-class citizens. But 13th Amendment, since it has become a sensitive issue, we have to be a little careful giving any promises on that or trying to implement it. Because it must be acceptable to the people in the south also. Otherwise, if we do something and the hatred, suspicion, mistrust, all that increases between the communities, then we have not achieved anything. So therefore, I personally feel, first we have to improve the economy of the country.
Now, since 2022, or even some months before that, many of us in Sri Lanka were lined up in queues, especially the fuel queue. Now, some of us had to wait in vehicles for days and physically push these vehicles to the filling station in order to pump some fuel into those vehicles. Now, during that time, allegations leveled at the then government for failing to meet the demands or failing to manage finances. Now, one of the ministers at that time was Udaya Gamanpila. Now, there are allegations that Udaya Gamanpila, as a subject minister, failed to inform the government of this impending crisis at the time. Now, what actually went wrong there? Was he at fault? Well, Newsfirst Budmin Amar Divakara spoke to Udaya Gamanpila last evening. Now, here's his response to these allegations.
It's an absurd argument. In fact, I delayed the fuel crisis as much as possible because of the prudent decisions taken by me, such as increasing fuel prices to curtail the demand, as well as obtaining loans from China and India to finance our fuel purchases. But I have been advising, our problem was we didn't have government to purchase adequate fuel, not only fuel, any imported product, but 25% of our import bill at that time was import of fuel. We didn't have foreign currency. As a person who has some knowledge in economics, since October 2020, I had been warning the government about forthcoming financial crisis, and I warned the government it may lead to economic crisis and it may lead to a political crisis. Unfortunately, they didn't have the capacity to understand what I explained, or they deliberately led the country to crisis to get a political advantage.
Now, let's shift gears from the political arena to another issue that Sri Lanka is facing. That's human trafficking. Now, over the recent months, since last year, our Newsfirst investigative journalists have been focusing on this issue. Now, we started off by exposing how Sri Lankan women were exploited and sent off to the Middle East through using tourist visa or visit visa to serve as domestic aids and other various forms of other employment. Then we also brought to the attention of how Sri Lankan youth were being smuggled using visit visas to Thailand and then across the border to Myanmar, where they are now working as cyber slaves, where they are scamming people online, forced to scam people online. Now, we've spoken to some of these individuals who are being forced to engage in cyber scams. They have told us that they have to sometimes stand for hours and hours every day to meet the targets given by their employers, who are forcing them to scam people from across the world. Now, if they fail to meet these targets, they are denied food, they are being electrocuted, they are being beaten and subject to various forms of torture. Now, these youth are appealing to the Sri Lankan government and appealing to everyone else to somehow rescue them and bring them back. Now, some of them were rescued and some of them were brought back to Sri Lanka, but there are still many others still trapped in those cyber slave camps over in Myanmar, especially in the region called Myawaddy, which is not controlled by the Myanmar government, but controlled by a group of rebels connected to criminal syndicates that are operating globally. Now, to combat human trafficking, one of the major bodies in the globe is the Bali Process. Now, Bali Process is engaged in combating modern day slavery. Now, families can reach out to the Bali Process and put their case forward, and the Bali Process actually engages in efforts to end modern day slavery, not only in Sri Lanka but across the entire world. Now, in order to combat human trafficking, many global agencies are working tirelessly around the clock. Now, recently, the US State Department also released a statement urging certain countries to increase efforts or boost efforts to combat human trafficking taking place in those countries. Now, one country is Sri Lanka. Now, the US ambassador to Sri Lanka, speaking at a forum last evening, stressed on the importance of Sri Lanka stepping up its efforts to combat human trafficking.
This issue cannot be addressed alone or in silos. It requires strong, reliable partnerships. Here in Sri Lanka, in the United States, or around the world, we recognize that human trafficking is a multi-dimensional problem. So, it requires multi-dimensional solutions. And that's why we value our partnership. with Sri Lanka to establish victim-centered, trauma-informed policies and strategies. I want to highlight the importance of fostering a greater collaboration to fight this grave crime. The United States recognizes the significant efforts that the government has been taking. These include increasing convictions for labor traffickers, canceling licenses, and blacklisting more recruitment agencies potentially involved in trafficking. The government also provided assistance to a great number of migrant workers and Sri Lankan diplomatic missions abroad, which is a welcome step. But more work remains to be done in Sri Lanka and globally. So this is why we need to increase efforts to investigate, prosecute, and in our State Department's annual report this year on trafficking in persons, we recommended that Sri Lanka increase efforts to investigate, prosecute, and penalize traffickers, including labor traffickers, and seek adequate penalties for convicted traffickers. And we encourage the government to proactively identify trafficking victims, including among undocumented migrant workers abroad, women in commercial sex, and ensure that victims aren't inappropriately penalized solely for unlawful acts committed as a direct result of being trafficked. In addition, we hope to see greater accessibility of victim services and support to victims, participate in trials. It takes a lot of courage to do these trials against traffickers.
Well, human trafficking is a major issue not only for Sri Lanka but across the entire world. And yes, everyone's calling for stepped up efforts in order to combat human trafficking. Now that brings a wrap to this edition of the Breakfast Rundown with me, Zulfick Farzan. Please do follow all our stories if you in case missed them on our award-winning website, that's www.newsfirst.lk, and our social media platforms on Facebook, YouTube, X, and Instagram, as well as TikTok. Well, until I meet you again on Monday at 7 a.m. right here, have a wonderful weekend and take care, and God bless.